Good morning, everybody, and welcome in this new webinar from Agora Energiewende. My name is Dimitri Pescia, and together with my colleague Christian Redl, we are very delighted to welcome you here and to present a new study we released a few weeks ago on the refining short-term markets to enhance flexibility. I can see that we are about already 85 people from different countries in Europe, and so we are very happy to welcome you here. As you know, the topic of power market design has been intensively discussed in Europe recently under the development of renewable energy, especially variable renewables, solar and wind. We have a discussion going on how to refine the way we are organizing our short-term markets. And in this context, Agora Energiewende asked two consulting firms from the Netherlands and from France to do an in-depth analysis on the different market design which exist in 7 key countries, which are part of what we call sometimes the Pentalateral Energy Forum. These 7 countries are Germany, France, Austria, Switzerland, and the Benelux countries, so Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. So this study is a pretty technical study, I would say. I don't know if some of you already read it. In any case, Christian Redl, which is one of our main and best experts in this topic, will go through this study with you today. Before doing so, I would like to point at some organizational remarks. The first one is that all the information that we are going to provide you today can already be downloaded on our website. So you can both download the study itself, also the presentation that Christian will present today, and then we will post the recording of the webinar itself on our YouTube channel. So you can already download the presentation if you didn't do it. You would normally see now a little arrow on your screen, so here is it, which will point at the place where you can download the presentation. So you will also see now normally a little chat window which would appear on your screen. And this chat window is an interface which allows us to communicate with you or you to communicate with us. So you can post some question there. This question will be addressed in the second stage of this presentation. So we will have first a presentation of the study, about half an hour, and then about half an hour Q&A session. So please post your question there. You can also write your names if you want, and then we would name it if you feel comfortable when we are addressing the questions. You know that, or you must know that this question will not be seen by the other participants of this webinar. We are the only people to be able to see them. We will try to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A session. If there is a lot of questions, which could be the case in this very technical study, we would come afterwards through email, answering all of them personally to you. So this chat window can also be used to post technical comments. If, for example, the sound is not good or if the image is not properly set, you can write your comment there. And we have here in the room with us today Nicolas Bock and Nele Moore, who would, and thanks a lot for them to be backing up here today, who would help fix any potential technical problems. So a final remark before starting, maybe you will see the screen a bit small in your computer, so you don't hesitate to use the full screen mode, which will enlarge the presentation. For our German audience, this is the full build button somewhere on your screen. And with this few introductory remarks, Christian, I would like to ask you to start and guide us through this presentation.
Thanks very much, Dimitri. Good morning, everyone, also from my side. Looking forward to also discussing with you the results of the study afterwards. For the presentation, I take the liberty to turn off the webcam, but nonetheless, I hope you can hear me clearly. So when we designed this study last year, basically, there were 2 main points of departure. The first one was that, of course, we see increasingly wind and solar PV dominating or even framing our power systems. Just to give you an idea, on the European level, The wind and PV share last year was some 10% in the European power mix, but by 2030 we expect to see some 30 to 35% of wind and PV being part of the European power mix. And with this, of course, comes a challenge, a flexibility challenge, due to the variability of wind and PV. And to manage this flexibility challenge, also the market design is critical. So in the first question, which was the starting point for us for the study, was, are the existing markets geared to deliver this demand for flexibility? And we focus specifically on the short-term power market, so the day-ahead, intraday, and real-time balancing markets, because it's these markets where the demand for flexibility materializes. So to answer this question, we performed together with, or Delft, the microeconomics, I should say, performed on our behalf this analysis, where they followed, let's say, a parallel or dual approach. First of all, assessing prices in this market, and I will talk about this in more detail afterwards, to get an idea on the efficiency or inefficiency in these markets, and secondly, to link this with key design features in the short-term markets, and from that derive then options for improvement. As Dimitri mentioned, the study focused on the Pentalateral Energy Forum Region, and that's then, let's say, the second starting point. Why do we focus on this region? Well, it's first of all an important power market region in the European electricity market, the Central Western market. And with the Pentalateral Energy Forum as an established forum for the bottom-up coordination and cooperation in the field of market design, market integration, but also security of supply and system adequacy, and recently also flexibility, we thought it's important to take this existing political momentum and assess the markets in this very region. Now, when we dive into the details, I think I should first of all say a bit or talk a bit about the methodology used. I mentioned already that an important pillar of this research was to assess pricing. And basically what Delft, the microeconomics, did is analyze, and we will see later some examples, the prices in the short-term markets in the region, and tested whether some theoretical principles apply, and under certain assumptions, these principles, if they can be observed, imply that the markets are functioning efficient. And that's first of all the marginal pricing principle, which is basically very simple. It says if prices follow marginal pricing, then prices increase when the market is tighter, and vice versa. Basically implying that prices are set at the marginal cost and marginal value to society, which maximizes welfare. The second important principle prices should obey to is the opportunity cost principle. Basically, resources can be used to produce several goods. For example, energy can be sold on the day-ahead market, or it can power plant can also provide its services to the balancing markets. Now, for prices to be efficient, the opportunity costs need to be included in the bids, for example, on the day-ahead market, meaning that the foregone benefit of not producing and selling then, for example, to the balancing market has to be included. And finally, the no arbitrage principle, which is simply the law of one price. It means that products which are essentially equal should also have the same price, and there should not be any systematic arbitrage opportunities. This is a temporal and a spatial dimension. We will see some examples afterwards. And now this pillar of pricing analysis is linked to an assessment of key market design features, and you see them on the right-hand side of this slide. Basically, what C Delphi Microeconomics assessed were key features in the domain of market access, in the domain of market completeness and market pricing, and I will talk about more detailed design features in the following slides. Now, what we can already say as a first overall result is, even though this is a region with a strong history in market integration and coupling, the specific domestic markets still show a very broad range of implementation, and basically that's valid for all these dimensions from market access to completeness and pricing. But it's just as a first general remark. Now starting with this issue of market access. Why is it important? Well, basically, of course, in this world of increased flexibility requirements, we need to ensure that as much as possible the flexibility potential is utilized. So we need all the players being able to sell their flexibility on the markets. And here, of course, demand-side participation is a very crucial aspect because it increases the portfolio flexibility, but it also typically contributes to cost minimization. So what we see in general is that demand-side participation is indeed allowed in the markets. It's certainly allowed in the day-ahead and intraday markets. On this slide, you see the provisions for balancing markets, for primary, secondary, and tertiary reserves in the 6 countries. Now we're talking only about 6 and not 7, because Luxembourg is simply part of the German balancing mechanism. And we do see indeed, yes, in all these balancing markets, both load and aggregated load can participate, with a certain exception of Belgium, where specifically secondary reserves are not yet including demand response. What's not shown in this slide, but I want to raise it nonetheless, is that independent aggregation, which simply means that the roles of balancing responsible parties and aggregator and balancing service providers are differentiated, are hardly institutionalized in the region. Independent aggregation would be required, let's say, for tapping the full potential of demand-side flexibility, also then smaller scale demand-side flexibility. But as you can see in the study, it's not on the slides, but you see a corresponding table in the paper, is that it's only institutionalized in France and Switzerland, and to a certain extent in Germany. Now, when we move forward to another important specification with respect to market access, that's how the products look like. What's the, let's say, the product lengths in the markets being traded and delivered. And what you see in this table is, first of all, again, for the balancing markets, the 3 main balancing products, how long the product duration is actually set. And you see first a column dealing with the temporal resolution of the energy bids, and then you see another main column dealing with the contracting period. So most of the TSOs only also contract operational reserves ahead of real term. They do not rely only on free energy bids, and you can see here the contracting lengths. I should also maybe outline that we use a color scheme, a traffic light scheme, Green basically means these are provisions which can maximize the flexibility potential. Orange is sort of in between, and red obviously means that it's not really incentivizing flexibility from all potential players. And specifically, we observe in the balancing markets for operational reserve contracting rather long contracting periods, typically up to 1 week, sometimes even a month or a full year. And you can imagine that that makes it rather difficult for, let's say, new service providers like renewables, demand response, or small-scale storage to commit over these long periods. It also means that these longer contracting periods interferes, let's say, with the actual product lengths on the balancing energy markets or intraday energy markets, because these product lengths are not aligned, which hampers, let's say, the potential for market players to include the opportunity costs, and also limits arbitrage between the markets. So something presumably rather critical with respect to getting efficient or inefficient prices. Before we look into some examples, again, some reflections on the trading periods. Here you can see the comparison of how long market actors can trade. First of all, in the energy market, so day ahead, intraday, and then in the balancing markets, again for reserve contracting, and then for energy bids. And what we see that typically trading, of course, and that's linked to the previous slide, starts quite ahead of real time for operational reserves. We do see some better alignment potentially with energy bids on the balancing market and energy bids on the day-ahead and intraday markets, but that critically hinges on that countries allow free bids without previous reserve contracting, and that's only the case, let's say, for all products. For example, for the Netherlands, and some other countries allow it for certain types of balancing markets, but there is, let's say, not an immediate clear link between, let's say, this column here and how long trading on the energy markets can take place. So again, this brings about uncertainties with respect to estimating the foregone value of not selling in the energy markets, and brings issues with opportunity cost pricing. Before we look into some examples, I want to raise another important dimension, and that's the cross-border integration and coupling of the markets. And here, intraday markets are really, let's say, in principle, a key element to move forward with an efficient incentivization of flexibility. But when we look how the domestic intraday markets are coupled, we see actually quite a huge range of differences. This table essentially shows how the domestic intraday markets are coupled, so meaning how the interconnector capacity in the intraday timescale is being included in this energy exchanges across borders. And you see that on certain borders, for example between France and Belgium, there is an explicit auctioning or I should say capacity allocation of the intraday interconnectors, whereas in other countries between, let's say, Netherlands and Belgium, we see some implicit coupling of the markets, meaning that the energy markets and the cross-border interconnector allocation clears within the same algorithm, which reduces uncertainties for market parties. And in some countries, we have even on the same border two mechanisms in parallel with both implicit and explicit auction. And this is sort of a misalignment between the energy trading and the cross-border capacity allocation, which also tends to induce quite some inefficiencies. It also restricts utilizing the flexibility provision across borders. Now, what does this mean for the empirical pricing in the markets? Here, as a case study, we compared or assessed the cross-border intraday markets between Germany and France. And first of all, let me explain the basic principle. You see here on the left a stylus graph which shows, let's say, the theoretical behavior. The blue line flows, intraday flows from the French intraday market to the German intraday market, and they can be positive and they can be zero, of course. And they should be positive whenever the French intraday market is cheaper than the German intraday market. So when there is a positive spread between France, a negative spread between France and Germany, then we should have a flow from France to Germany, and it should be zero, of course, if the intraday price in France is higher in Germany, than in Germany. And the same you can see in pink for flows from Germany to France. It's of course then mirrored, so flows from Germany to France occur when the French intraday market is more expensive than the German one. So that's this theoretical pattern we would expect, but when we look at actual data, you see that it sort of diverges quite a bit from the theoretical pattern. And basically we see two main differences. First of all, we see also trades going in the wrong direction. That's indicated here with this adverse flows part of the diagram, meaning that there are flows, let's say take this point, flows from France to Germany, even though the French intraday market is more expensive at that moment than the German one. And we see it also in the other way around, flows from Germany to France, although the German intraday market is more expensive. And we also see flows in the right direction, of course, but then a lot of flows do not fully utilize the available interconnector capacity, and that's basically indicated in this part of the diagram when we look from flows from France to Germany. For example, here you see, let's say this point would mean that the French intraday market is some 20 euros per megawatt hour cheaper than the German one, but the available capacity and interconnector is only utilized to some 70%. So you could even move more from France to Germany, and this of course means that flexibility is not provided at the lowest cost in the entire region. What are potential causes for this quite strong inefficiencies? First of all, as we've seen in the previous table, that both explicit and implicit capacity allocation is implemented. It's also, since intraday markets basically work through continuous trading, associated to difficulties to include in this implicit market coupling of continuous intraday markets the value of the interconnector. So basically it's offered for free in the intraday time frame, and no matter whether there is a shortage of interconnector capacity or whether there is abundance, it always has the same value, namely zero, which of course is not efficient. And that's also related that for the intraday cross-border markets, it's currently relying only on implicit continuous trading. There are no auctions, and of course if you would, for example, also include cross-border auctions in the market, you could effectively and efficiently value the interconnector in this auction. Moving forward to a different dimension related to how complete are the markets, that's how the delivery periods are aligned. You can see here that, of course, the day-ahead and intraday markets typically have product lengths of either 1 hour or 15 minutes. But on the balancing markets, we see product lengths. It doesn't mean that, of course, the balancing energy is that long deployed, but at least the bits have to be over time horizons which are up to 48 hours, for example, in Germany and Austria over the weekend. And this means that we have some misalignment in the trading between these markets, which again distorts the optimal price formation. What's also important to point out is the link to the imbalance settlement periods. In most of the countries in the regions, it's 15 minutes. While in France it's set to 30 minutes. But when you, for example, look at some day-ahead or intraday markets, you can only trade 60 minutes products. But when you are balancing responsible over 15 minutes intervals, it means that you cannot actively or fully hedge yourself against the imbalance risks on the day-ahead and intraday markets, because you simply cannot trade the equivalent products. A positive example which shows the advantages of having a very tight alignment between, let's say, the product lengths and the trading opportunities on the day ahead and the intraday and the balancing markets is shown in this graph. It shows basically the German intraday market, which is first of all the most liquid in the region, but it also has 15 minutes products to be traded. And this is important to facilitate the wind and PV integration in the system. What you can see on this graph is first of all the pink line, which is over the month of November 2015, the day-ahead forecast error of wind generation in the German system. So it's the actual wind in real time minus its day-ahead forecast. So if you have a positive forecast error, it means that there was more wind than forecasted. And you also see then in blue the spread between the intraday price and the day-ahead price. So if the spread is negative, then it means that the intraday price is below the day-ahead price. And what you can see that there's sort of a very good mirroring of this forecast error on the intraday market spread, because if the forecast error is positive, we have a negative price. So if there's more wind closer to real time than originally forecasted, then we see that this excess is sold on the intraday market, and then intraday prices decrease, and vice versa. So it gives market parties, and in Germany essentially you can say that renewables are balancing responsible to, let's say, 95% I would say of the installed capacity. And then they have a strong incentive to avoid paying imbalance penalties, and they then use the intraday markets to trade the updated generation forecasts, which is again working here due to this rather tight alignment between the different market segments and the product lengths. Now, the last main category relates to market pricing, and there's not too much to say here. Interestingly, we have, of course, this theoretical principle which would say that marginal pricing, so pay-as-cleared mechanisms, would induce efficient prices. But when we look at the balancing energy price formations, we see it's mainly pay-as-bid, which is implemented, and only the Netherlands includes pay-as-cleared. Now that also would tend to cause inefficiencies, and indeed we see some maybe possibly rather complex but still interesting price patterns in the balancing markets and also in the imbalance settlement schemes in the region. What this graph shows you, and that's, let's say, the final empirical example I want to highlight is the comparison of the imbalance spread on the y-axis, which is the imbalance settlement price per ISP, so per imbalance settlement period, over the day-ahead price. And on the x-axis you see the net regulation volume deployed as a function of the maximal net regulation volume in that year. And the graph compares Germany, France, Netherlands and Belgium. And what we would expect, let's say, is that any shortage of real-time energy should induce a positive balancing market spread and vice versa. And we should also expect that the balancing spread should be close to zero when we have small volumes of imbalances in the system. And actually this expectation is only true for the Netherlands, so that's this sort of light green line. It goes through zero and it increases steadily with increasing net regulation volumes, both for positive and negative imbalances. For the other countries we see non-zero spreads for, let's say, close to zero deployments of balancing energy. And there are many reasons causing this, let's say, not necessarily efficient pricing behavior. When we, for example, look at the German price patterns, that's this purple ones, you see very high imbalance prices for very low or close to zero imbalances. And this is because the German imbalance price is calculated as a function of the net regulation volume. So when you are in a ISP with many positive and negative deployments of balancing energy, you can take the net, and it could be close to zero, and then you take this in your formula to calculate the imbalance price. Then you have your costs, the TSO has its costs, and it divides it over zero, so you sort of get an infinite imbalance price. Whereas the other countries typically use the gross regulated volume to calculate the imbalance price. For Belgium we see this sort of step function around zero for the imbalance price, and that's again related to how the imbalance price is calculated. First of all, Belgium uses average pricing. So you have the merit order of balancing energy, but for the imbalance settlement price it's not the clearing price or the most expensive bit, but the average of all the energy bits on the balancing market. And it also uses pro rata, so parallel activation for smaller regulation volumes, and this then gives you this this step function. What we can say as a general conclusion when looking at the balancing markets and the imbalance settlement price provisions is that we hardly see this marginal pricing principle being followed, and we also see that the balancing markets in the region typically diverge both in terms of pricing but also in terms of activation of the available resources. Now, what does this lead us to conclude on the current status of the short-term markets in the region? Well, first of all, we can say, and when we look into the report, you will find many more examples that the short-term markets in the regions are actually characterized by, I would say, a rather surprising patchwork of different concrete implementations of the market design elements. Some of them are efficient realization, some of them are rather inefficient. So you get really a patchwork of the current short-term market design in the region. This tends to, at least to a certain extent, distort the wholesale price formation, which would then increase also the costs of providing flexibility. That means since the region has, let's say, established political structures to coordinate and cooperate, that this political momentum is certainly required also in the future, to when it's becoming more important that the markets are designed in a manner where flexibility can be remunerated and incentivized, that these efforts have to be even more coordinated across borders. Diving into more details, we conclude that essentially the current market designs are biased against new flexibility providers like demand response, renewables, or small-scale storage, and that's a lot related to how the products look like. So we would require indeed small bid sizes or short contracting periods in the balancing markets to tap this flexibility potential, and to let's say fully tap demand-side flexibility. Also a framework for independent aggregation would be required. When we look at two very important market segments, first of all the balancing markets, we've seen that they show quite a large differences in the region, again leading to inefficient pricing, but not only in the balancing markets, but more importantly also in the day-ahead and intraday markets. So of course improvement would be if the region agrees on a joint balancing market design, which is characterized again by short products and late gate closure times, short contracting periods, and marginal pricing, because that would enable an efficient cross-border competition first of all, but also maximize the flexibility potential. And I would like to point out that getting pricing right in the balancing market is really important. I mean, from a volume size, they will always stay limited, but they are key for price formations also in the preceding intraday and day-ahead markets, where then of course most of the flexibility is traded, and we need then these intraday and day-ahead markets distorted to the least extent possible. And finally, with respect to actually integration of wind and PV in the system, intraday markets are key to move forward efficiently. But we have seen that the intraday markets are quite differently designed, also how they are coupled across borders. So an important step forward would be to harmonize here the coding rules with respect to gate closure and product lengths, both for energy and capacity, but also to improve the continuous trading, where, for example, as mentioned, the interconnector capacity is valued always for a price of 0. Or also an important step forward could be the implementation of cross-border intraday auctions, which would then also allow the better valuation of cross-border capacity. So much for a quick but still rather deep and technical dive into the short-term markets in the region. I, of course, encourage you to have a look at the study. You can download it on our website, which shows you much more design features than I could discuss now in this half hour. But I would also take the liberty to highlight other reports we have published dealing with market design, specifically in the regional and European context. You can see them on our slide, and if you want to stay, of course, up to date to new publications, please feel free to subscribe to our newsletter, which you can also find the link on our webpage. Yeah, with that, I thank you very much for your patience, and I look very much forward to the Q&A session and hand over to Dimitri again.
Well, thanks a lot, Christian, for this very interesting presentation, and I can firstly say that we got a lot of questions. So, and also that I can see that most of the people who joined us from the beginning are still there, meaning your study and our study interests and drive several questions from our audience. So thanks for that. We have, I would say, two broad categories of questions. I will try to structure them. We have high-level question and more technical question. So maybe to smoothly enter into the topic, we have about 20 minutes to do so. So I'm afraid we'll not be able to answer everything, but let's start with we had several questions on the high level related to the fact that Germany adopted recently new market design law, Strommarktgesetz, and some question was related to how these different critical elements that you presented today have been implemented in the law itself. This was one of the questions we got, so maybe you could start with that.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. Well, first of all, indeed, this law was, I think, agreed upon before the summer break, so a couple of months ago. And some of these, I mean, the whole idea is indeed to increase the potential from markets to enable flexibility. But when we look at the actual provisions, I think there is not too much I can specifically highlight. First of all, an important step forward is to, when we look at, let's say, marginal pricing as a principle, which should prevail in the markets, that, let's say, the price cap has been withdrawn or eliminated, so this can allow then the full valuation of flexibility in the real time, and it takes further steps to enable further independent aggregation. So far, Germany allows independent aggregation for tertiary reserves, but now it should also open this segment for secondary reserves, and the secondary reserves are the most important source of balancing in a German system. It also alludes to changes in the balancing market design, but there's nothing concrete in the law, but the German regulator is tasked to reform these balancing markets, and there's currently consultation going on, and I guess we can expect some changes indeed on the lines of product length, product duration and pricing, but yeah, it's an ongoing process.
And on this specific topic of balancing, we had this question, would you expect that Germany would move to marginal pricing for the balancing under the Strommarkt 5.0?
Yeah. Well, from our study, I think we can say that marginal pricing is really the best practice in the region, and I think it's then not only Germany who should do this or who can do this, but again, I want to point out it's about coordinating this in the region, and of course it's not only Germany now working on its adjustment of the balancing market, but this is also an important topic in the Pentalateral Energy Forum Region. So I think it's the countries should and hopefully aim for coordinating their efforts in the balancing markets. We see already quite some alignment. Primary reserves are, for example, coupled or jointly auctioned between the Netherlands, Austria, Germany and Switzerland, and there is imbalance netting implemented in the region with the exception of France. So there are some steps where markets are increasingly coupled and integrated, and the next big step will be for secondary reserves, and I think there it would be the room for a joint adjustment of this principle.
It links quite well to another question related to the political process and schedule of this harmonization. The question being, how do you see this harmonization process happening in terms of time scale? Could you maybe give us a little bit your feeling about that?
Yeah, frankly, I cannot judge the time horizon. I would say that over next year we can expect some developments on further coupling and integrating secondary reserves. At least the TSOs in the region are working on this, but whether they will also already have a final result next year or maybe in 2 years, I can't really say. I'm sorry.
Digging a little bit more technical maybe now, we have this question from actually University of Oslo, from a lawyer, not an economic perspective. Actually, Mr. Julius Rumpf was pretty active in asking questions, so I name him because he delivered his name explicitly. We may not be able to answer all your questions, but one of them I thought could be interesting at this stage. It was about we speak at the beginning that the arbitrage principle is actually characterizing an efficient market, but according to Mr. Rumpf, this is not a goal to be achieved, but just a metrics. The question is, so arbitrage should be possible until markets are efficient? Is that correct?
Well, I think I would agree in the sense that it's not a goal in itself, but if prices perform, or if prices are assessed and one can see that this arbitrage pricing principle, is prevailing in the prices, I think that's just an indication that prices tend to be efficient. Of course, it depends on certain other assumptions as well. So it's a means to ensure or to check whether price formation is indeed efficient. Whether it's a goal in itself or not, I'm not sure how to frame it best.
Thank you, Christian. And again, a bit from this dimension of a more technical aspect, we have this question from the Explore framework. You may be aware of this framework between Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, and the TSO of these companies, of these countries. Sorry. The question is, what impact do you expect from this implementation of this project? So I'm sure you're aware and you know this project itself, but we have a question related.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm not.
We'll try to get some information for you more in detail, and we may come back directly with technical response on that. We had interesting question, maybe also a bit on the more political level. We spoke already about the Strommarktgesetz. This one is coming from Julian Schorp from Context. I think it links well to the agenda which is happening currently at the European level. And the question is the following. I will read it because I find it quite, structurally interesting. So the EU Commission wants to give up the priority dispatch and priority access for renewables. In the market design proposal, which is currently on the table. And the Commission promises to do so by having at the same time the creation of well-functioning balancing and shorter markets which are fit for renewables. Now the question is, given the analysis we are performing, and that we show that indeed a lot of inefficiencies are still underlying these markets, isn't it too early, and is it really possible to push for the end of this priority dispatch? Meaning, implicitly, if I rephrase a little bit this question, would renewable be able to fully operate into a market environment without specific treatments?
Well, first of all, I would fully agree and say no. We're not there to abolish priority dispatch. Given that, first of all, we have seen that the markets indeed are not yet providing this level playing field, and what is more, we have, let's say, a system which is characterized by a lot of inflexible baseload generation, which still is there if we abolish priority dispatch. So any step forward to reduce priority dispatch can only happen if in parallel, let's say, the market design elements are optimized and also this inflexible generation from the conventional side is reduced. And maybe to link to the second part of your question, whether renewables would then be, let's say, available to fully operate and finance themselves in the energy markets, if we have this efficient set of markets available. I would say that's also not the case for two main reasons. First of all, we have a rather weak outlook on the ETS price, also till 2030. So we have currently a massive surplus of some 2 billion certificates in the ETS, in the emissions trading scheme, and that surplus is expected to grow even though there are some reforms with respect to market stability reserve or increasing the linear reduction factor. But this will not instantaneously reduce the ETS surplus, so we'll have to expect rather low ETS prices throughout 2030, and that means that market-based investments from renewables, specifically for wind and PV, even though on an LCOE basis the cheapest option available, no matter whether you compare renewables or non-renewables, the lowest total costs in terms of generation arise from large-scale PV and onshore wind at this time throughout Europe. So these energy market-based investments into these technologies will not be possible. And a final thought, not only is the ETS an issue, but simply we have, from a market perspective, no need for any investment, because on average the European markets are oversupplied, which is shown also in record low wholesale prices. So there is no need for any market-based investment, although there is, of course, strong need for renewables investments due to climate targets and reaching climate objectives. So that means for any prospect that the energy market can play a stronger role in financing renewables, we have to take care to reduce the surplus capacity, which again is then, in terms of the transition, critical with respect to inflexible baseload capacities in the system. So more and more, I think countries should also target to, for example, phasing out, for example, old coal plants in a managed way.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. So indeed, your answer went much beyond maybe the scope of this specific study itself. We have indeed published interesting work on this context also, so thanks for bringing also this information here. To come back to the study, one point was referring to the length, product length. We are mentioning that 15 minutes product in the intraday market have a very positive effect for basically trading flexibility, adjusting to forecast, better forecasts. If this is the case, do we still really need to have also 15 minutes product on the day ahead market? And overall question, what are the state of the implementation of specific 15-minute products in the region and specifically Germany? Do you have some information on that?
I think it's best shown on this slide. Well, here you can see that in Germany and Austria you have, and Switzerland, you have 15 minutes products on the intraday market, and you have also the imbalance settlement period of 15 minutes in that region. And on the Austrian day-ahead market, we also have 15 minutes products. Now, Germany also starts intraday trading, with an auction day ahead. So you could well argue whether maybe Germany also has sort of an implicit 15 minutes day-ahead product. But indeed, in these countries where these 15 minutes products on the intraday market are available, they are really utilized a lot for market parties to adjust from the day ahead stage, which is typically the 60-minute scheduling, to then this relevant 15-minute scheduling for the balancing obligations and responsibilities. So whether, well, in the end, I mean, we do not have regulated markets. We can see whether the markets adjust on their products also on the day ahead scale. It will also be probably then how market parties demand this. But what I would certainly feel is that we get more and more 15 minutes trading in the intraday markets. That I would say is the next step, presumably being visible.
Okay, thank you, Christian. This question related to the incentive to avoid imbalance fees and costs. So the role of having strong imbalance price settlement, which incentivize this balance. One of our audience remember or recall a report from NSOE, which come to the conclusion that in an assessment on the imbalance pricing scheme, that in Germany there is actually not necessarily a proper design. We have currently, according to this person, this two-price imbalance settlement scheme. No, we don't have it, and this one could provide more incentivize to having a proper functioning of this imbalance settlement. What would you think about this?
Well, I think that what comes out from the study is that I would say single imbalance pricing is probably the more efficient way forward. Basically, that incentivizes, well, first of all, market parties to obey to their schedules, but it also allows that market parties to contribute passively to balancing the system. So if the system is short and you as a market party are long, then you would receive in a single imbalance pricing scheme, receive the imbalance price. So and the dual pricing would always penalize penalize imbalances, no matter whether they are, let's say, helping the system or not. So I think we conclude that single imbalance pricing would be a better way forward, but at the same time, of course, with respect to that, typically in the region, the imbalance settlement price is calculated through average pricing of the balancing energy bits deployed, and not, let's say, marginal pricing. You again get some deviations from, let's say, marginal pricing, which lowers than the incentives for market parties. But of course, I agree that the imbalance settlement scheme is pretty complex on a national basis, and even if you do the comparison, I mean, I didn't show the table, but if you look at this, I don't even want to show it closer, because then you just see extremely long formulas which are very complex. So I think there is a lot of room for improvement, as is also shown in this graph, to get closer to these incentives which should transmit through, I would say, marginal pricing and then single imbalance pricing mechanisms. But I think also that the network code on electricity balancing mentions these two options as, let's say, the favorite ones.
This links to a question from Julius Rumpf again on this very specific issue. And Mr. Rumpf names the Terra project, which is apparently working in this direction. And according to Mr. Rumpf, this Terra project is considering more to move to a PS bit instead of PS cleared, which may be a seeming paradox. What would you say in this respect?
It's a very good question. I think that the Terra project, I think that's a project, and probably that also now reminds me a bit what the Explore project is. I have the feeling they are both projects dealing with coupling tertiary reserves. And Terra is, I think, between UK, France, and Switzerland. And both UK and France have currently PS bit. So that, of course, gives room to some interesting discussions, because you can get some, well, path dependency in which region to start with your harmonized balancing market design. I'm just aware that this is a topic also the official Pentalateral Energy Forum process is dealing with, and I'm for sure they are discussing this in detail. But I'm frankly not in the position to say, okay, which route will then be the main one.
We happen to just receive some information from one of our participants about the Explore project. I have difficulties to read it through all, but thank you for this contribution. Also, we'll integrate that, and we may come back to you. One question was related to the independent aggregation, and you said at one point, pretty beginning of the presentation, if I remember, that it is hardly institutionalized currently in the region. The question was, why do you think it has been hardly institutionalized? Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's sort of a complex issue, because typically you have the supplier which aggregates all its demand, and then potentially also uses this to sell on the balancing market. So historically you have the balancing responsible party and the balancing service provider being the same entity. Now, of course, with developments on end-use technology side, digitalization, etc., needs for more flexibility, aggregation, as we have seen in Germany for renewables, was an important step forward to directly market the electricity, and this can also then help to facilitate the demand side potential. Now, I'm not really an expert on demand response per se, but to fully tap, let's say, the available potential, this independent aggregation would at least allow for it. But for that, you need to separate the roles of the BRP and the BSP. The aggregator would then be the service provider, taking some of the demand flexibility of a supplier, but the supplier is balancing responsible. So you need to ensure that the actions of the aggregator, will affect the imbalance of the supplier. And for that you need, let's say, either contracts, bilateral contracts, or some regulatory standards for setting up these contracts, or even to simply allow it from a regulatory perspective. So on many angles or layers, you would need to adjust existing provisions.
Thank you very much, Christian. We still have several questions to answer, but I see that we are already at 12 o'clock in Berlin time. So we will come back to these several questions through email. First of all, thanks a lot, Christian. I think you really did a great job, brought a lot of concise information, and I have to say a lot of the comments we received were also stressing and highlighting these facts. Your presentation was very clear, and the question and answer helpful. So once again, thanks to all of you, and we would be very happy to get you back in our next webinar. To keep updated from our information, I would advise you, if you not have done it yet already, to register on our website. You could register on our mailing list. You will not receive any spam, but you will get announcement from events like this one. So thanks again to all of you, and we'll be happy to see you next time.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.